Some folks will laugh at a choice before they ever try to understand it. And that afternoon at the Millerton Depot, laughter came easy and quiet like dust lifting off the boards under too many boots and too much sun, the kind of dry Texas heat that settles into your collar and stays there. And Clara Whitmore stood at the far end of the platform with her carpet bag resting against her ankle. Watching the last curl of steam fade from the train that had brought her west, 10 women had stepped down. With her, 10 promises written in careful ink and sealed with hope, and one by one those promises were already being claimed. Men stepping forward with hats tipped and eyes measuring, voices low and practical, taking the pretty ones first, the ones who smiled easy, the ones whose dresses still held their color, and Clara did not move when the first name was called, nor the second. She simply folded her hands in front of her, fingers still, knuckles pale but steady, as if she had learned long ago that stillness could be a kind of armor. The station master called out another introduction. A girl with soft hair and quick laughter was led away, her boots barely touching the wood, as if she were already lighter for being chosen, and the space around Clara widened without anyone saying a word. It always happened that way. Not sudden, not cruel in any one moment, just a slow shifting, like chairs being pulled back from a table you were no longer invited to sit at. A pair of women near the water barrel leaned close together, their whispers carrying just enough to reach her ears. Something about being sent back once. Something about trouble no man wanted to take on twice. Clara kept her gaze fixed beyond them, out toward the tracks that cut a straight line into the horizon, as if she could follow them back to a place where choices had not yet been made for her. The sun pressed down harder as the minutes stretched. The boards beneath her boots creaked with each new departure, and still she did not step forward, did not speak, did not offer herself up in the way some of the others had begun to do when their turn came too close. She only shifted her weight once, a small movement, adjusting the sleeve of her faded dress where the seam had been mended with careful stitches, neat and precise, the kind of stitching that held longer than the cloth itself. Another name called, another man stepping forward, and the laughter started then, soft at first, the kind that pretends to be harmless, but it carried, rolled across the platform like wind over dry grass. Someone said something about saving the worst for last. Someone else answered, and Clara felt it pass over her, without letting it land, because there was a way to stand in a place like that, a way to hold yourself so that even if no one reached for you, you did not shrink, you did not bend, and she had practiced that way of standing more times than she could count. The list grew shorter, the voices quieter, until there were only 2 women left, then one, and the station master cleared his throat as if the sound alone might fix what was left undone. Clara could feel every eye now, not because they wanted her, but because there was nowhere else to look. She was the last, the one not chosen, the one the afternoon would remember if it remembered anything at all, and still she did not speak, did not plead. She simply stood there with her bag and her steady hands and the dust settling around her boots, as if she had already decided that whatever came next, it would not be shaped by the sound of other people laughing. The station master shifted his weight beside the ticket window, papers in his hand that no longer had any use, and the sound of the departing wagon wheels faded down the dirt road until even the dust began to settle, leaving Clara alone on the platform with nothing but the creak of the wooden boards and the low murmur of those who had stayed to watch how the last of it would end. Because people always stayed for the ending when they thought it might be a poor one. A man near the water barrel let out a short breath that might have been a laugh and tipped his hat back as if the whole thing had been some small entertainment, and Clara reached down to adjust the handle of her carpet bag, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do that was not shaking. The leather was worn smooth beneath her fingers, familiar in a way nothing else in this place was. She could feel the weight of everything she owned inside it: 2 dresses, a folded shawl, a small tin of sewing needles wrapped in cloth, each item chosen not for comfort, but for survival, and she straightened again without looking at anyone directly, though she knew they were all looking at her now in that quiet way people look when they think you have already lost. The station master cleared his throat once more and took a step forward as if he might say something kind or official, but no words came, because there was nothing left to announce, no name left on his list, no man stepping up from the road. Only the long stretch of afternoon and the weight of it pressing down. Clara turned her head just slightly toward the tracks, measuring the distance with her eyes. 10 miles to the nearest town, they had said. Maybe more if the road curved. The way roads always seemed to do out here. The sun would drop in a few hours, and with it the small comfort of being seen. She considered it then, not with panic, but with a quiet calculation, the kind that comes from having made difficult choices before. She could wait another day. She could ask the station master for work or a corner to sleep in. She could turn back in the morning. But each of those options carried a kind of shrinking she had promised herself she would not return to. The whispers shifted again behind her, softer now, almost disappointed that she had not broken, that she had not begged or cried or given them the ending they expected, and she felt something settle inside her, not heavy, not light, just certain. She reached for the handle of her bag again, and this time she lifted it clean from the boards, the movement simple and unhurried, as if she had been planning it all along. A few heads turned at that. The motion of leaving always caught attention in a place like this, and she stepped down from the platform onto the packed dirt, her boots landing steady, the ground firm beneath her. She did not look back at the station or the people gathered there. Did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her face as she chose her direction, west toward the town they had mentioned, toward whatever waited beyond the line of low buildings and the thin strip of trees in the distance. The road stretched out ahead, pale and dry, marked by wagon tracks that told of others who had gone before, and she adjusted her grip on the bag as the first step carried her away from the place that had not chosen her. The second step easier than the first, the third, already part of a rhythm, and behind her the platform fell quiet again, as if the story had ended, as if nothing more would come of it. But somewhere beyond the edge of that silence, a different kind of sound began to rise, slow and steady, the distant echo of hooves against hard ground, too far yet to draw notice from most, but close enough that it would not remain unnoticed for long. The sound of hooves carried differently than voices. It did not scatter or fade in the same way. It held together as it traveled across the open land, steady and deliberate, and Clara heard it before she turned, not because it was loud, but because it did not belong to the quiet she had just stepped into. She slowed her pace without stopping, her hand tightening slightly around the handle of her bag as she listened, counting the rhythm without meaning to. One horse, not a wagon, not a group. Just a single rider coming in from the far edge of the road where the dust rose in a thin line against the horizon. Behind her the platform had not yet returned to its ordinary business. A few people still lingered, their attention shifting as the sound reached them as well, heads turning in that slow, curious way that meant something had interrupted the expected ending. Clara did not turn immediately. She had learned that turning too quickly gave something away. So she took another step, then another, her boots pressing into the dry dirt, until the rhythm of hooves came closer, clearer, each impact measured, unhurried. And then she stopped, not because she had been called, but because there was a point when not stopping would have felt like running, and she did not run from things that had not yet shown themselves. She turned then, just enough to see him, the rider cresting the small rise beyond the station, a tall man on a dark horse, the kind of seat in the saddle that spoke of long hours and no wasted motion. His hat pulled low against the sun, his shoulders straight but not stiff, as if he carried weight that did not need to be shown. The horse moved beneath him with an easy confidence, neither rushed nor hesitant, and something about the way he approached did not match the laughter that had filled the platform only minutes before. The sound behind her shifted again, quieter now, voices dropping as recognition began to move through the small crowd. Not loud, not announced, just a change in the way people stood, the way they watched. Clara felt it without needing to hear the name. She adjusted her grip on her bag once more, not out of nerves, but out of habit, the leather warm now from her hand, and she met the direction of his approach without lowering her gaze. The rider slowed as he neared the station, the horse stepping down from the packed road onto the softer dirt with a small shift of weight, and he brought it to a stop not in front of the platform, not among the others who had already made their choices, but a few yards out, as if distance itself was something he chose carefully. He did not speak at first, did not call out. He simply looked, his eyes moving once across the platform, taking in the empty space where the other women had stood, the men who had already left, the station master still holding papers that no longer mattered. And then his gaze settled on Clara, Not with the quick measure she had seen before, not with the kind of glance that searched for flaws, but with a stillness that held, as if he were noticing something others had passed over. Clara did not move under that look, did not shift her weight or drop her eyes. She simply stood as she had before, shoulders straight, hands steady, the dust at her feet lifting slightly in the faint breeze, and, for a moment, nothing else moved. Not the people behind her, not the horse beneath him, not even the sound of the wind. It was the kind of quiet that came when something had not yet decided what it would become, and then he tipped his head just slightly, not quite a greeting, not quite a question, and in that small motion something changed, not loudly, not enough for anyone to name it yet, but enough that the ending they had all expected no longer fit the shape of what was about to happen. No one spoke first, not the station master, not the men who had lingered too long, not even the wind that had carried the dust across the road only moments before, and the rider let the silence hold as if it were something worth keeping, his hand resting easy on the reins, the leather worn and familiar, the horse beneath him shifting its weight once, and then settling again. Patient as the man who rode it, Clara stood where she was, the distance between them neither closing nor widening, and it was clear to anyone watching that whatever would happen next would not be hurried along by words. The station master finally stepped forward, his voice coming out thinner than before, as if it had lost some of its earlier certainty. He said the rider's name in a tone that carried recognition and something close to caution, and a few heads turned at that. The kind of turning that happens when a name carries more weight than the man himself needs to announce. The rider gave a small nod in return. Not dismissive, not welcoming, simply acknowledging. And then his gaze moved back to Clara as if the rest of it had already been settled in his mind. He swung one leg over and stepped down from the saddle in a single smooth motion, boots landing firm on the dirt, and for a moment he stood beside the horse without moving closer, giving the space the same kind of respect he had given the silence. Clara watched him approach only when he chose to take the first step, and even then his pace did not change, steady, unhurried. Each step measured like he had already decided where he was going long before he arrived. The people behind her shifted again, their voices low but no longer careless. There was a different kind of attention now, the kind that leans forward instead of looking away. The man stopped a few feet from Clara, close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the sun having written its years there without asking permission, and his gaze moved once more, not across her face in the quick way she had seen before, but lower, to her hands where they held the handle of her bag, the skin marked by work, the grip steady despite everything that had passed. He took that in without comment, without surprise, as if it were the only thing he needed to understand. Clara did not shift under that look, did not offer explanation, or apology for what she carried or what she was not. She simply met him with the same quiet she had held since stepping off the train. And something in that meeting did not belong to the platform or the crowd or the afternoon that had nearly ended without her. It belonged to a different kind of choice, one that did not ask permission from those watching. The station master cleared his throat again, louder this time, as if to reclaim some part of the moment that was slipping away from him. He began to say something about the arrangements, about how there had been a misunderstanding or a delay, but the rider did not look at him, did not answer. He only kept his eyes on Clara, and when he finally spoke his voice was low, not raised for the benefit of the others, but it carried anyway, because the silence around it made room for every word. He said he was late, not as an excuse but as a fact, and the words settled between them without apology. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, simply recognition, as if she had been expecting something to arrive even after she had begun to walk away from it. Behind her a voice broke from the quiet, sharp with disbelief, asking if he meant to take her, and the question hung there, not directed but unavoidable. The rider did not turn toward it, did not answer the man who had asked. Instead he reached for the reins of his horse and then looked back at Clara, waiting, not pulling, not urging, just leaving the space open for her to step into or walk away from. And in that moment the choice that had been taken from her all afternoon settled back into her hands, quiet and steady as the grip she had never loosened. Clara did not move right away, not because she did not understand the offer, but because she understood it too well, the weight of it settling into the quiet space between them, and she shifted her grip on the carpet bag once more, feeling the worn leather press into her palm, as if reminding her of every mile that had brought her here, every decision that had not been hers to make until now. The man waited without speaking, his hand resting lightly against the reins, not pulling the horse forward, not stepping closer, simply holding the moment open in a way she had not been given all afternoon. And behind her the crowd stirred again, not with laughter this time, but with something sharper, something edged with disbelief. A voice rose just enough to carry, saying she was the one left behind, saying there had to be a reason, and another answered with a low chuckle that did not quite find its way into full laughter. Clara heard it all, and let it pass through her without settling. Because she had heard worse in quieter places, she lifted her eyes back to the man in front of her, studying him in the same way he had studied her, not searching for kindness, not expecting explanation, just looking for something that held steady. And what she saw was not softness, not warmth, but a kind of certainty that did not bend under the weight of other people's voices. He gave a small nod toward the horse then, not a command, not an expectation, just a direction offered and left, unforced. And Clara looked at the animal, a dark gelding with a calm eye and a stance that did not shift under the noise behind her. She stepped closer, one measured step that closed the distance she had kept since the beginning, and the boards of the platform behind her creaked as someone shifted, the sound of it oddly loud now that no one was speaking outright. She reached the horse and paused there, her free hand lifting just enough to touch the worn leather of the saddle, testing it the way a person tests something they may soon rely on. The man moved then, but only slightly, adjusting his hold so the reins would not pull, giving her space to decide how she would mount, not offering a hand, not assuming she needed one. And that small absence told her more than any promise could have. She set her bag across the saddle first, securing it with a practiced motion, then placed her boot against the stirrup, the movement steady, deliberate, as if she had done this before or had learned enough from watching to do it without hesitation. She pulled herself up and settled onto the seat, her posture straight, her hands finding a balance point without reaching for him. The horse shifted once beneath her and then stilled, accepting the added weight without fuss. And when she looked down again, the man was watching, not with surprise, not with approval, just with that same quiet recognition, as if what he had seen in her from a distance had been confirmed up close. The voices behind them rose again, louder now that the choice had taken shape. Someone asked if he knew what he was taking on. Another muttered something about mistakes that would not be easily undone. But he did not turn toward them, did not answer. He only placed his foot in the stirrup and mounted behind her in one smooth motion, the space between them measured and respectful, his hands taking the reins without touching her. And for a moment they both sat there, the dust lifting lightly around the horse's hooves, the platform behind them full of eyes and unfinished words. And then he gave the slightest pressure with his heel, and the horse stepped forward, carrying them away from the place where she had been left behind, not quickly, not as an escape, but with the same steady pace that had brought him there in the first place, as if leaving was simply the next part of a path he had already chosen. The road stretched out ahead in a pale ribbon of dust, the kind that held the marks of wagon wheels and cattle drives long after they had passed, and the rhythm of the horse beneath them settled into something steady and unhurried. Each step measured the same as the last. Clara sat upright in the saddle, her hands resting lightly against the worn leather in front of her, not gripping, not bracing, just learning the movement as it carried her forward. The wind shifted as they left the station behind, carrying away the last faint sounds of voices and replacing them with the quiet that lived out beyond the reach of town. For a while neither of them spoke, and the silence did not press or strain. It simply existed between them like open land, wide and unclaimed. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, the low line of trees growing clearer with each passing minute. The heat of the afternoon easing just enough to let a breeze move through the folds of her dress, and she became aware of small things, the creak of the saddle with each step, the soft jingle of metal against leather, the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed earth. The man behind her adjusted the reins once, a subtle motion that guided the horse without pulling, and she noticed the care in it, the way control was held without force. After a time he spoke, not loudly, not to fill the silence, but as if the words had reached the point where they belonged. He said his name, Ethan Hayes, and let it settle without offering anything more. Clara turned her head just slightly, enough that her voice would carry back without effort. She gave her own name in return, Clara Whitmore. The exchange simple, without question or explanation, and when the silence returned it felt different, no longer empty, but marked by something shared. They rode for what might have been a mile, maybe more. Distance out here was measured less by numbers and more by the way the land changed, the road narrowing slightly. As it bent toward a shallow rise, the grass along the edges thinning where cattle had grazed, Clara shifted once in the saddle, adjusting to the movement, and he noticed without commenting, only easing the pace a fraction as if giving her time to settle into it. The gesture small enough it might have gone unseen, but she felt it in the change of rhythm beneath her, the horse slowing just enough to smooth the path. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had come before this moment. After another stretch of quiet, she spoke again, not turning this time, her voice steady as she asked if the distance to his place was far. He answered that it was. A little over 8 miles, maybe closer to 9 depending on the turn they took at the creek, his tone even, not apologizing for the distance, not making it sound shorter than it was, just stating it as fact. Clara nodded once, though he could not see it, and adjusted her posture again, settling deeper into the ride. The sun had begun its slow descent, the light shifting from harsh white to something softer, casting longer shadows across the ground, and for the first time since stepping off the train she allowed herself to think not about where she had been left, but about where she was going, not with expectation, not with hope, but with a quiet acceptance that whatever waited ahead would be met the same way she had met everything else, standing steady, hands sure, and not asking to be chosen, but not refusing it when it came. The land began to change in small ways that only became noticeable if a person had been watching for a while. The flat stretch of dust giving way to patches of dry grass that brushed softly against the horse's legs, the road narrowing as it curved toward a shallow creek bed where the ground dipped just enough to catch what little water passed through after a rare rain. Clara felt the shift in the horse's stride as they descended, the careful placement of each step over loose stones and hardened earth, and she adjusted with it without thinking, her body learning the rhythm faster than her mind could name it. Ethan guided the horse with a slight pull and release of the reins, not breaking the silence, but shaping it. And when they reached the bottom, the air felt cooler for a moment, carrying a faint scent of water and something green that had managed to survive where the rest of the land had not. Clara glanced down as they crossed, noticing the thin ribbon of water no more than a few inches deep, moving slow and quiet between smooth rocks. And for a brief second she saw her reflection there, blurred by the current, a figure she barely recognized from the woman who had stood alone on the platform. She looked away before the thought could settle, lifting her gaze back to the path ahead. The climb on the other side of the creek came gradual, the horse steady beneath them, and as they reached the rise the horizon opened wider, revealing a stretch of land that rolled gently toward a cluster of distant structures, small against the fading light, but distinct enough to mark a place that belonged to someone. Clara noticed it without asking, her eyes tracing the outline of what might be a barn, a fence line, something that suggested more than just survival. Ethan spoke then, his voice low, saying that was his place, not with pride and not with apology, just a simple statement that placed the land and the man in the same quiet sentence. Clara nodded again, feeling the distance between where they were and where they would arrive settle into something real. The sun had dropped lower now, casting a warm light across the ground that softened the edges of everything it touched, the shadows stretching long behind them, and the air cooled just enough to carry the sounds farther, the creak of the saddle, the steady rhythm of hooves, even the faint rustle of grass moving in the breeze. They rode on without hurry, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but shaped by what had already been said and what had not needed saying. Clara shifted her hands once more, resting them lightly over each other, and she became aware of a small detail she had not noticed before, the way Ethan kept a measured distance even in the saddle, not crowding her space, not guiding her with touch, only with the movement of the horse and the direction of the road. It was a kind of respect she had not expected and did not question. As the buildings grew closer she could make out more, a fence that had been repaired more than once, posts set firm despite their age, a roof that caught the last light of the day, and a line of trees that stood slightly apart, as if marking a boundary between what was his and what lay beyond. She drew in a quiet breath, not from nerves, but from the recognition that this place, whatever it held, was no longer something imagined. It was waiting, steady and real. At the end of the road they had begun together without promise and without explanation, and as the horse carried them forward the last of the sun dipped lower, leaving behind a soft glow that settled over the land like something that had been there all along, simply waiting to be seen. The closer they came, the more the place revealed itself in quiet details that spoke louder than anything grand. The fence lined straight, but not new. Each post set deep and held in place by time and care rather than fresh wood. The gate standing slightly open as if it had been left that way on purpose, not carelessly, but with the kind of habit that comes from knowing what belongs and what does not. Ethan guided the horse through without needing to dismount, his hand steady on the reins, and the horse stepped over the worn path that had been marked by years of the same motion. Clara felt the shift from open land to something contained, not closed in but defined, the air carrying a different weight here, a sense of use and purpose that lingered in the ground itself. The barn stood off to the left, its wood faded to a soft gray under the sun, doors closed but not neglected, and beyond it a smaller structure that might have been for tools or feed, everything placed where it made sense, rather than where it looked best. The house came into clearer view as they approached, modest in size but solid, the kind of place built to last through seasons rather than impress anyone passing by. A single window caught the last light of the day, reflecting it back in a way that made the whole place feel warmer than it might have otherwise. Ethan brought the horse to a stop near the front of the house, the ground there packed firm from repeated use, and for a moment neither of them moved. The quiet settling again, but this time it held something different, not uncertainty, but arrival. Clara looked at the door, then at the window, then at the space around them, taking it in without letting her thoughts run ahead of what she could see. Ethan dismounted first, the motion smooth and practiced, his boots landing with a soft thud against the dirt, and he reached up to take the reins in one hand before stepping slightly to the side, leaving space for her to decide how she would come down. Clara shifted her weight and swung her leg over, lowering herself carefully, her boots finding the ground steady beneath her. She did not reach for him, and he did not offer, and in that small exchange something unspoken held its place. She turned then, taking her bag from where it had rested across the saddle, adjusting the strap in her hand, the leather now marked by dust from the road. Ethan tied the horse to the post near the porch, his movements quiet and efficient, each action done without hesitation, as if the routine of it mattered more than the presence of someone new. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at the house for a moment, not as if seeing it for the first time, but as if measuring it against something only he understood. Then he moved toward the door and pushed it open, the hinges giving a soft sound that spoke of use, but not neglect. He stepped inside first, not to lead but to make space, and Clara followed after a brief pause, crossing the threshold with the same steady step she had carried from the station. The air inside was cooler, holding the faint scent of wood and something that had once been cooked there not long ago. The room was simple, a table set near the center with 2 chairs, a stove against the far wall, shelves lined with tins and jars arranged in a way that suggested order without decoration. Clara's eyes moved across each detail, not judging, not comparing, just seeing, the kind of seeing that took note of what was there and what was not. Ethan closed the door behind them, the sound of it settling into the quiet of the room, and for a moment they both stood there, the space between them no longer filled by distance or road, but by something closer, something that had yet to find its shape. And outside the last light of the day slipped lower, leaving the house wrapped in a calm that did not ask questions and did not offer answers, only the quiet presence of a place that had been waiting without knowing for whom. Clara remained near the door for a moment longer after it closed, her hand still resting lightly on the strap of her bag as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside, the shift from open sky to enclosed space settling over her in a way that felt both unfamiliar and oddly steady. She moved a few steps forward, slow and deliberate, her gaze traveling across the room again, taking in the table first, its surface worn smooth in places where hands had rested often. Then the two chairs, one slightly pulled back as if it had been used more recently than the other. The stove stood quiet now, but there was a faint warmth still lingering in the iron, a sign that it had not been long since a fire had burned there. Ethan moved past her without hurry, setting something small on the table that she had not noticed him carrying. Perhaps a folded cloth or a tool from outside. It did not matter what it was as much as the way he placed it. Careful, exact, as if every object in this space had its place whether anyone else saw the reason or not. Clara set her bag down near the chair closest to her, not claiming it, just placing it where it would not be in the way, her hands empty now. She let them rest at her sides for a moment before bringing them together lightly. In front of her, a habit she had carried with her through places where she had not known what to do next. Ethan stepped toward the stove and crouched, opening the small door to check the coals inside. He added a piece of wood with a quiet motion and closed it again. The faint sound of the fire catching returning to the room, soft and steady. Not enough to fill the silence, but enough to give it a different shape. Clara watched without asking, noting the rhythm of his movements, the way he did not rush even simple tasks, as if time here was not something to be pushed, but something to move through at its own pace. He stood then and reached for a kettle resting nearby, lifting it and pouring water into a tin cup before setting it back. He placed the cup on the table within reach, but not directly in front of her, leaving the space open for her to decide if she would take it. She stepped closer after a moment, the floorboards giving a soft sound under her weight, and she wrapped her fingers around the cup, the warmth spreading slowly through her hands. She did not drink right away, just held it, letting the heat settle into her skin. Ethan took the other chair, not sitting yet, his hand resting on the back of it as he looked at her, not searching, not questioning, just present. And for a moment the quiet stretched again, but it no longer held the same uncertainty as before. Clara lifted the cup slightly, taking a small sip, the water plain but warm, grounding in a way that went beyond taste. She set it back down carefully, her fingers lingering on the rim for a second before she let go. She glanced once more around the room, her eyes moving to the shelves, the arrangement of tins and jars, each one placed with purpose. Then back to the table where two chairs stood across from each other, not close, not distant, just enough space between them to hold something that had not yet been named. She drew in a quiet breath and looked back at Ethan, her expression unchanged but her presence different now, no longer standing at the edge of something but within it, and though no words had been spoken to define what this place was to her, or what she was to him, there was a shift, small and steady, like the first piece of wood catching flame in a stove that had been waiting for heat, not loud, not certain yet, but enough to begin. The fire in the stove settled into a steady burn, the soft crackle filling the spaces where words might have been, and Ethan finally pulled the chair out and sat, the movement simple but carrying a kind of finality, as if sitting marked the beginning of something that standing had only delayed. Clara watched him for a moment before taking the other chair, not mirroring him exactly, but meeting the moment in her own time. The wood beneath her steady, the table between them worn but clean, a place made for use rather than display. The cup still warm near her hand. She rested her fingers lightly beside it instead of around it now, as if she no longer needed its warmth in the same way. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, not tense, not idle, just present. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same quiet weight as before. He said there was no need to explain anything from before unless she chose to. That what mattered here was simple. Work needed to be done, the house needed keeping, the land needed tending, and there would be food and a place to stay in return. He did not dress it in promises, did not make it sound like more than it was, and that made it easier to hear. Clara listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, taking in not just the words but the way he said them, the lack of expectation behind them, the absence of anything that asked her to be different than she was. When he finished, the silence returned again, but it felt different now, shaped by something understood. Clara nodded once, a small motion but certain, and she spoke then, her voice even, saying that work did not trouble her, that she had done more with less before, and that she would do what was needed here the same way, without complaint and without asking for more than was offered. Ethan gave a slight nod in return, As if that answer matched something he had already seen. He stood then, moving toward a narrow door set into the far wall. He opened it and stepped aside just enough to show the small room beyond, a bed set against one wall, a folded quilt resting neatly on top, a single chair in the corner, and a small window that caught the last of the fading light. He said it was hers if she chose to stay. Again, leaving the decision where it belonged, Clara rose from her seat and stepped toward the doorway, pausing just at the threshold as she looked inside. Not measuring comfort, but noticing care. The way the quilt had been folded, the way the room had been kept ready without knowing who it would be for. She stepped in then, placing her hand briefly against the back of the chair, feeling the solid wood beneath her fingers, then turned back toward him, her expression unchanged but her eyes carrying something quieter now, something settled. She said she would stay, not with hesitation and not with urgency, just as a fact. Ethan nodded once more, the motion small but enough, and he stepped back, giving her the space to make the room her own in whatever way she saw fit. The light outside dimmed further, the last of the sun slipping beyond the horizon, and the house settled into evening. The fire steady, the air cooling just enough to make the warmth inside feel earned. And though nothing had been declared and nothing had been promised beyond what had been said, something had taken shape between them, not loud, not certain yet, but present, like a place that begins as shelter and slowly becomes something more without ever needing to say so out loud. The night settled in without ceremony, the kind that came quietly over the land as if it had always been there waiting just beyond the edge of daylight. And Clara sat for a while on the edge of the bed in the small room, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she listened to the faint sounds of the house beyond the door, the low crackle of the fire, the soft shift of boots against wood, the small, steady noises that told her someone else was there without needing to see him. She rose after a time and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened outline of the land, the fence barely visible now, the sky stretching wide above it filled with stars that seemed closer here than they had any right to be. She stood there a moment longer before turning back, setting her bag down on the chair and opening it with careful hands, taking out only what she needed, not spreading her things, not claiming the space too quickly, just placing them in a way that allowed her to stay without unsettling what had already been. When she stepped back into the main room, Ethan was at the table, a plate set before him, another placed across from it. Simple food, beans and bread, nothing more but enough. He did not look up right away, not ignoring her, but allowing her to enter the space on her own terms. Clara crossed the room and took the seat he had left open, the chair scraping softly against the floor as she pulled it in. They ate without speaking, the quiet not heavy, not strained, just shared, the kind of quiet that did not ask to be filled. Clara noticed the small things, the way he waited until she had taken her first bite before continuing, the way he reached for the bread and left enough on the plate without counting it. Habits formed without intention but held with consistency. When the meal was done, she gathered the plates without asking, carrying them to the basin near the door, rinsing them with water that had been set aside, her movements efficient, practiced, not seeking approval and not waiting for it. Ethan watched once, briefly, then turned his attention back to the fire, adding another piece of wood with the same quiet care as before. The room warmed slightly as the flames caught. Clara finished and set the dishes to dry, wiping her hands on a cloth she found folded nearby, placing it back exactly where it had been, the kind of small order that kept a place steady. She paused then, standing near the table, unsure for only a moment before stepping back toward the doorway of her room, not retreating but allowing the night to settle as it would. Ethan spoke then, not loudly, just enough to reach her, saying that morning started early, that there would be coffee before the sun rose and work after. Again, not a command but a simple truth of the place. Clara nodded, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. She said she would be ready, her voice even, and there was something in it now that had not been there before, not just acceptance but a kind of quiet readiness. She stepped into the room and closed the door part way, not shutting it fully, leaving it open just enough for the light from the main room to reach the floor near the bed. The fire continued its steady sound, the house holding its warmth against the cool of the night outside. And as Clara lay down, she did not think of the station or the voices that had filled it. She thought only of the rhythm that had begun to take shape here, small and steady, built not from promises but from simple acts, from the space that had been given and the choice she had made to step into it. And somewhere in that quiet, without needing to name it, the first sense of belonging settled in, not loud, not certain, but present enough to be felt. Morning came before the light, the kind that began as a quiet shift in the air rather than something seen, and Clara woke to it without needing to be called, her eyes opening to the faint outline of the room still held in shadow, the quilt warm around her but the air beyond it cool. She lay still for a moment, listening, the house already moving in small ways, the soft sound of wood settling, the low stir of fire being coaxed back to life. She sat up then and swung her feet to the floor, the boards cool beneath her boots as she dressed without hurry, each motion practiced, deliberate, the same way she had learned to move through mornings in places that were not yet hers. When she stepped into the main room, the light had only just begun to touch the edges of the window, a pale gray that would soon turn to gold. Ethan stood near the stove, a kettle already set, steam just beginning to rise, the smell of coffee faint but steady. He glanced at her once, a brief acknowledgement, then returned his attention to the task at hand. Clara moved to the table and paused there, her eyes taking in the room again in the early light. The shapes softer now, the details clearer. She reached for a cloth and wiped the surface of the table, though it did not need it, the motion more about beginning than cleaning. Ethan poured the coffee into 2 tin cups and set one within reach, not directly handed, just placed. She took it with a small nod and wrapped her hands around it, the warmth spreading slowly, grounding her in the morning that had come without question. They stood for a while in that quiet, the first light growing stronger, stretching across the floorboards, catching on the edge of the table and the curve of the cup. After a time Ethan spoke, not loudly, just enough to carry. He said there was fencing to check along the north line, a section that had loosened after the last wind, and that there would be time before the heat set in to see it right. Clara nodded, setting her cup down and reaching for her gloves where she had placed them the night before, the leather worn but strong. She slipped them on with steady hands, not asking where to go or how far, trusting the direction would come when needed. They stepped outside together, the air cool and clean, carrying the scent of dry grass and earth, the sky opening wide above them now, pale blue stretching into distance, the land waiting in that quiet way it had, not changed by their arrival, but ready to be met again. Ethan moved toward the barn and returned with tools, a coil of wire, a hammer, simple things carried without show. Clara took what he handed her without hesitation, their hands brushing only for a moment, not lingering, not avoided, just part of the exchange. They walked then along the fence line, the ground firm beneath their boots, the posts set at intervals that marked both boundary and care. Clara noticed where the wire had slackened, where the tension had been lost, and she moved to it without being told, holding it steady as Ethan worked, their movements falling into rhythm without instruction, each understanding the task without needing to speak it aloud. The sun rose higher as they worked, the light growing warmer, the shadows shorter. And though the labor was simple, it carried a kind of quiet satisfaction. Each section repaired a small act of keeping something whole. When they paused, Clara wiped her brow with the back of her glove, her breathing steady, not strained. Ethan glanced at her once, a brief look that held neither doubt nor surprise, just acknowledgement. And they continued, the fence stretching ahead, the day opening with it, and somewhere in the repetition of motion, in the shared silence and the steady work, the space between them shifted again, not by words or promises, but by something quieter, something built from doing rather than saying, until even the land seemed to recognize them not as strangers passing through, but as two people moving within it with purpose, side by side. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the fence line stood tight again, the wire drawn firm between posts that no longer leaned, and Clara stepped back a pace to look at what they had done, not with pride and not with relief, just with a quiet recognition that something once loose now held steady. She removed her gloves and brushed the dust from them with a small motion, her hands marked faintly from the work, but steady as they had been the day before. Ethan checked the last section, with a brief pull, testing the strength without saying it, then gave a short nod, more to the work than to her, though she saw it all the same. They turned back toward the house without needing to say so, The path familiar now in a way it had not been when they first crossed it, the ground carrying the imprint of their steps from earlier, the air warmer, the light brighter, but still holding that same wide quiet that did not press or demand. When they reached the yard, Clara paused near the porch, her gaze moving across the place once more, the barn, the fence, the house standing where it had stood before she arrived, and yet not the same in the way she now saw it. Ethan moved past her to the door and opened it, stepping aside as he had the evening before, not out of habit alone, but as if the gesture itself had become part of the space they shared. Clara entered without hesitation this time, her step sure, her hand brushing lightly against the frame as she crossed. Inside the room held the warmth of the morning fire now settled low, the table cleared from earlier, the two chairs still set across from one another. Not changed, not rearranged, just waiting as they had been. She moved to the basin and washed her hands, the water cool against her skin, rinsing away the dust of the morning, then dried them with the cloth and placed it back where it belonged, each motion fitting into the quiet order of the place without needing to be explained. Ethan set the tools down near the wall and poured water into 2 cups, placing one on the table, the same as before, the small consistency of it carrying more weight than any words might have. Clara took the cup and sat, not waiting this time, not measuring the distance between what was offered and what she would accept, just taking her place as it had been given. Ethan sat across from her, the space between them unchanged in measure, but different in feeling, not empty, not uncertain, just there, holding what had been built without needing to name it. For a while they drank in silence, the only sound the faint movement of the fire and the quiet shift of wood settling beneath them. Then Clara spoke, not because the silence required it, but because the moment allowed it. She said the fence would hold through the next wind, her voice calm, certain, and Ethan looked at her then, not surprised, not questioning, just seeing, and he gave a small nod in agreement, the kind that did not need to be earned but was given all the same. The afternoon stretched ahead beyond the walls of the house, more work waiting, more quiet tasks that would shape the days in ways both small and lasting. And as Clara set her cup down and rose, moving without hesitation toward what came next, there was no longer any sense of being left behind, no echo of the voices that had once defined her place. Only the steady rhythm of a life beginning to take shape not through grand gestures or spoken promises, but through the simple act of staying, of working, of being seen without being asked to change. And in that quiet, without announcement or claim, something settled into place, not as a sudden certainty, but as a truth that did not need to be spoken to be known. That sometimes the choice that others question is the one that sees most clearly, and sometimes the place you are not chosen for is the very thing that leads you to where you were meant to belong.